For centuries, an extraordinary war has raged across the world's oceans, above and below the waves.
You could kill hundreds of people with one broadside. These were extremely powerful war machines.
Shipbuilders designed bigger and faster vessels to outwit and crush their opponents.
That nation that has most powerful battleship fleet can destroy the enemy's battleship fleet and therefore control the seas. And if you control the seas, you control the world.
They carried terrifying weapons.
This was going to be the first time that somebody had fired a torpedo in anger since World War II. They needed to get it right.
But ships have also liberated and rescued thousands.
You can think of Gerda 3 as basically a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis.
And inspired men and women to acts of incredible bravery.
I will take you there now, to your cannons, to your death. We will sink before surrender.
These vessels and their crews have shaped world history.
As the commanding officer of a missile-carrying submarine, I was directly responsible for helping to prevent World War III.
This time, the underwater arms race. How submarines went from being a one-man operated floating barrel to sophisticated hunter-killers that could change the course of a war. Over the years, warships have become larger and more deadly, but they've always been vulnerable. You didn't need an impressive navy to sink a ship. What you needed was a vessel that could strike underwater.
The great thing about a submarine is that it's invisible. You could attack ships secretly, covertly. The submarine is the ultimate stealth platform. It can use underwater explosives. Don't make holes in the top of a ship, make holes in the bottom of a ship, because then the ship will sink.
The submarine has proved itself to be capable of remarkable feats of endurance and speed.
The ship was actually so fast at the time that this portion, as well as several other portions, were actually ripped off the deck. We'd never before had a submarine capable of this kind of force and power.
But also to be a terrifying killing machine. The 7th of December 1941, Pearl Harbor. Almost 20 United States Navy vessels were lost that historic Sunday morning. One of those that managed to escape was a light cruiser named the USS Phoenix. Amazingly, she was unharmed. 41 years later, her luck would run out. Sold to the Argentine Navy, and with a new name, she would be stalked by a British Royal Navy submarine and sunk. Her loss would make headlines around the world. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentina's military government invaded the Falkland Islands, 300 miles off the coast of South America, and under British control since 1833.
It's probably hard to realise for people who weren't around at the time the size of the shock when people woke up and learned that the Argentinians had invaded the Falklands. And then the news started showing coverage of Argentinian soldiers standing over British soldiers lying flat on the ground. It was taken very, very seriously.
In response, Margaret Thatcher's government sent a task force comprising 100 vessels. A 200-mile exclusion zone was set up around the Falklands, and the government declared any Argentine warship found within this zone will be treated as hostile and liable to be attacked by British forces. The nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror was part of the task force. It was ordered to sail to an area close to the Falklands, where the warship General Belgrano was believed to be sailing. As the USS Phoenix, she survived Pearl Harbor. But this was a new type of war.
The General Belgrano was a rather old, but still moderately capable Argentinian cruiser escorted by 2 missile-equipped destroyers. It was part of a planned attack on the British task groups.
HMS Conqueror, nicknamed Conks, was a Churchill-class nuclear submarine. On the 30th of April, her sonar detected a group of ships 100 miles away. The Conqueror went in pursuit. The following day, the ships were located outside the exclusion zone. The Conqueror's navigator, Narendra Setia, kept a diary.
There is one cruiser, the Belgrano, 2 destroyers and an oiler. We caught them in the middle of a replenishment at sea, which would have made a superb target, but unfortunately, they were south of the exclusion zone.
The safest place for the submarine to be, in order to follow the Belgrano and remain undetected, is directly beneath her. So for many of the 13 hours or so before the attack, Conqueror is actually 150 feet below the Belgrano, which is a kind of sinister thought.
At 5 a.m. on the 2nd of May, the Belgrano and her small flotilla received a message to return to their base at Ushuaia. There's been much debate whether the British intercepted this signal. What isn't disputed is that the British Task Force commander, Sandy Woodward, was deeply concerned for his servicemen and women, who he felt were vulnerable from an Argentine attack.
As far as Admiral Woodward was concerned, he was still in great danger, and that danger would be significantly reduced if the Belgrano group was wiped off the slate.
Mrs. Thatcher's War Cabinet met to consider the Admiral's request to sink the Belgrano. Permission was given.
The signal then went to the Conqueror, sink the Belgrano. The captain very calmly announced to the crew, we're going to go to action stations after lunch. They had roast pork and apple pie and crumble for their lunch. And then they moved in on the Belgrano.
This afternoon I knew what fear was. At 1400 we received a sign authorizing us to sink the Belgrano, even though it was outside the exclusion zone.
It's just worthwhile pausing to think about what's going on, because these people have drilled this procedure hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. They're kind of doing it on autopilot, but I've spoken to many of them, and all of them, right up to the moment where they pressed the button, did not believe that they were going to be firing the torpedo.
The Conqueror was armed with the new Tigerfish Mark 24 torpedo. But it was unpredictable. The officers met and decided to rely on something more old-fashioned.
Their thinking was, we're looking at a World War II ship, and what we've got on board is a torpedo that actually was originally developed in World War I and was very reliable, the Mark 8. It's basically a bomb with an engine attached. And their idea is that they're going to fire 3 torpedoes in a slight fan so that they've got the maximum chance of hitting the Belgrano as it goes past. Captain Rayford Brown says, fire. He was a quietly spoken man, and nobody had ever heard him speak this loudly before.
The atmosphere was electric as the seconds ticked away. 43 seconds after discharge, we heard the first explosion, followed by 2 more. 3 hits from 3 weapons. The control room was in an uproar, 30 people shouting and cheering.
The first torpedo missed and hit one of the destroyers, but failed to explode. The second torpedo hit the Belgrano's bow, just below the dining hall. The third hit her stern.
We will never forget hearing the sound of the Belgrano breaking up. The sound was like the tinkling of glass from a huge chandelier that has crashed to the ground.
290 sailors were killed instantly. Another 33 perished in the water or in the life rafts.
We can't go back and apologize now. It's too late. I wonder how many died. I wonder even more what the reaction will be.
I think the general reaction in Britain at the time was jubilation. But if you read the memoirs of a lot of naval officers who were on the scene at the time, quite a lot of them are concerned that plainly there will be retaliation, and an all-out war is from that point really unavoidable. And that's exactly what did happen.
The British retook the Falklands, but with a significant cost to both sides. After an uneventful voyage, HMS Conqueror, flying the Jolly Roger, the signal of a successful engagement with the enemy, returned home to Faslane submarine base. The Conqueror had shown the efficiency of the modern submarine. She was, in fact, the culmination of 200 years of hard endeavour by ingenious designers, often working at speed in the middle of a war. Those pioneering submarine crews were well aware they were always just a few seconds from sudden death. Warships have always been vulnerable to attack from below. The question was, just how could you make an effective submarine? The hunt began in earnest in the 18th century, as the New World fought for independence from the Old. This is a replica of the Turtle, thought by some to be the world's first submarine to attack a warship. It was built in 1775 by a young American engineer named David Bushnell. The United States was at war with Britain, and Bushnell was convinced his revolutionary design could be used to great effect against the Royal Navy. The submarine was made of oak, reinforced with iron bands. Its one-man crew pedalled to move forwards and turned a handle to operate the top propeller. At the bottom were two ballast tanks that filled with water to make the Turtle submerge, and a pump to empty them and so rise to the surface, a feature of all future submarine designs.
In modern parlance, I think it would be called a one-man midget submarine, designed to lay charges under enemy ships.
The Turtle was equipped with a detachable drill bit. Once it had penetrated the enemy's hull, the Turtle would move away, leaving behind an explosive charge with a built-in clockwork detonator. The legend is that in 1776, a soldier named Ezra Lee volunteered to disrupt the Royal Navy blockade of New York Harbor by crossing the East River in the Turtle and placing an explosive under HMS Eagle. The story goes, the screw device was unable to penetrate the Eagle's copper sheeting. However, historians have questioned this account.
This would have been a big, heavy, cylindrical wooden barrel with no hydrodynamic properties that you would typically associate with a submarine. So I think the physical effort of actually moving it no more than a few hundred yards would have been actually quite enormous. Whilst attempts may have been made to attack warships, I rather suspect the attack on the Eagle might have been wishful thinking rather than the actual.
Nevertheless, 20 years after the Turtle was built, President George Washington wrote, "I then thought, and still think, that it was an effort of genius." The Turtle had shown that a primitive submarine had the potential to damage an enemy ship. It would take another conflict on American soil to encourage a further significant leap in submarine design. The Civil War saw both bloody battles and great technological change. There were developments in weaponry and transportation, and also innovation at sea. Within days of the outbreak of war, the Union forces of the North established a blockade of Confederate ports, known as the Anaconda Plan, to cripple trade in cotton and munitions. In response, the South devised an ingenious strategy.
They were looking for new ways to exploit technology to actually mount attacks on the superior fleet that was inflicting a lot of economic damage on them.
A group of Southern businessmen and engineers, led by 40-year-old H.L. Hunley, experimented with submarines in Alabama. Their greatest success was a 30-foot vessel named the Fishboat. Attempts to use electric batteries and steam power had failed. They now relied on something more old-fashioned.
It was the most developed of what you might call the man-powered submarines, the submarines that relied on human power.
The fishboat was operated by 8 men turning a propeller shaft. It had 2 ballast tanks, one at either end, and along the keel, weights that could be detached for emergency buoyancy. News of the submarine made its way to the Confederate Army, defending their biggest port, Charleston. It was hoped that if an explosive was attached to the fishboat, it could blow up the Union ships.
During 1863, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard was in command of the defenses of Charleston, and he wanted to do everything he could to try and break through the blockading fleet.
During trials, the submarine's crew claimed they surfaced so close to the blockading ships, they could hear the sailors singing. However, the fishboat sank twice. A total of 13 crew members drowned, including the designer H.L. Hunley. The sub was named after him in his honor. Undeterred, a new volunteer crew was found and a plan devised to sink the USS Housatonic, anchored off Charleston, a key vessel in the North's blockade of the harbor.
The Housatonic was quite a significant American surface ship. And after initial failures, they managed to get the Hunley into position. It sort of paddled its way forward with the men inside working very hard. These early boats were armed with spar torpedoes, that is, a spar pointing from the front with an explosive on the end. The trouble with that was it was virtually an early version of suicide bombing.
We call them torpedoes, but really they're mines at the long of a long pole. They have a barbed end, so when the ship rams the hull, the barb will keep it in there as the Hunley then has to back out.
The Housatonic's lookout spotted the Hunley, and the ship desperately tried to slip her anchor to escape. It was too late.
The spar torpedo contacted the Housatonic, it went off, it caused a huge explosion.
She disappeared below the waves in only 3 minutes, the first ship to be sunk by a submarine. 5 of her crew drowned. The Housatonic sank, but so did the Hunley.
At one level, this was the first successful submarine attack. But at another level, it demonstrated that really you had to develop a better weapon for the submarine, and also to produce a proper power system as well.
A more effective method of propulsion was not long in coming. It was developed by an unlikely Victorian inventor who managed to harness the latest steam technology, but would be ultimately defeated by the sea. In November 1995, off the coast of Rhyl in North Wales, a diver spotted something unusual lying on the seabed. It soon became clear that this was a wreck, the wreck of a vessel with worldwide significance. Invisible for over 100 years, it was the world's first fully powered submarine. It was designed not by a shipbuilder or an engineer, but by a young curate named the Reverend George Garrett.
He was a very eccentric, very knowledgeable, very interesting type of guy. I mean, a clergyman who builds submarines. This was a venture into a new type of warfare, something he hoped to sell to the Royal Navy, and we would be one step ahead of all the other navies in the world.
Garrett sketched his design for the submarine on the back of an envelope. It was to be powered by a fireless steam generator, similar to those just introduced on the London Underground. Hydroplanes on each side would take the submarine underwater, and when the engine was stopped, it would rise to the surface. The submarine had a serious purpose. It was designed to be able to carry torpedoes. This replica stands in Birkenhead Docks, just feet from where the submarine was launched on November the 26th, 1879. Garrett christened her Resurgam.
Resurgam is a Latin phrase for I shall arise, and what a fantastic name for a submarine, I shall arise.
Early trials in the River Mersey were successful. although conditions for the three-man crew were almost unbearable.
The heat from the boiler was intense, varying from 110 to 115 degrees, and we experienced great discomfort from the air pressure on the eardrums. We had to stand all the time owing to the very limited accommodation, and when we returned to the surface we were all exhausted.
The interior of the Resurgam was gloomy. The only light was provided by candles.
The pioneer submarine crews were brave and they were prepared to take on an adventure because it would have been like nothing else they'd ever experienced, trying to operate and work inside a submersible.
The Royal Navy asked George Garrett to demonstrate in Portsmouth, hundreds of miles away, what his submarine could do. So in January 1880, Garrett sailed with his two-man crew from Birkenhead docks, up the Mersey and out to sea. He expected the voyage to take a month.
The navigator had lost his bearings, and we came up alongside a full-rigged ship homeward bound for Liverpool. When Mr. Garrett threw open the top and shouted "Ship ahoy!" and inquired where we were, the captain of the ship was terribly surprised and inquired who we were. We informed him that we were a submarine torpedo boat from Liverpool and we're going to Portsmouth. The captain then asked how many were in our crew, and when Mr. Garrett told him 3, the captain answered, "Well, you are the 3 biggest fools I have ever met."
It's January, the weather is bad. He eventually realised he couldn't progress any further and went into the estuary at Rhyl on the North Wales coast.
A yacht later took the Resurgam under tow, but the rope snapped. Heavy seas swamped the sub, whose conning tower hatch couldn't be closed from the outside, and she sank in 60 feet of water. The tragedy, Chris Holden believes, is that even if Garrett and the Resurgam had made it to Portsmouth, the Admiralty weren't genuinely interested in his invention.
The Navy thought they were underhand and we shouldn't be using submersible ships to inflict damage. It was big warships, big guns, that was the way forward. This was something sneaky, definitely underhand.
Just a decade after Garrett's death, submarines would become a deciding factor in a world war and possess technology and deadly weaponry that he could only have dreamed of. The 19th century had been a time of great submarine experimentation, with mixed results. But by the early years of the 20th century, reliable petrol engines revolutionized their performance. Submarines were now something to be feared. On the 28th of March 1915, at the height of the First World War, a British ferry named the Brussels left Harwich for the neutral Dutch port of Rotterdam. Its skipper was 45-year-old Captain Charles Fryatt. He knew these waters well. It was his 143rd crossing of the war. A few hours into the voyage, a German submarine, U-33, was spotted on their starboard bow. Her captain, Comrade Ganser, signalled to the Brussels to stop. Ganser had been in command of U-33 for 5 months and was keen for his first kill.
In 1915, the Germans began unrestricted submarine warfare. They unleashed their submarines to attack enemy and indeed neutral merchant ships in certain zones on site. They were allowed to torpedo them on site. This was an attempt to blockade Britain. The only way the Germans could. They couldn't defeat the Royal Navy on the surface, so they would use their U-boats as commerce raiders.
As far as merchant captains like Fryatt were concerned, their home waters were now a war zone. They could be attacked without warning. The U-boats were gaining a dangerous reputation.
There were cases of people being picked up out of the water, put on the casing of a submarine, and the submarine would dive. Certain German captains were not really gentlemen, even if they weren't actually pirates.
Fryatt had only seconds to decide what to do about U-33. What he feared most were not her torpedoes, but her deck gun. Fryatt knew these guns had sunk scores of merchant ships, It was time to fight back.
U-33 had a 105mm gun on board which carried 300 rounds of ammunition. That's compared to the 6 torpedoes it carried. Submarines didn't have a huge arsenal of torpedoes.
Captain Fryatt decided to cancel out the threat posed by the deck gun. He would ram U-33.
He ordered his engine room to put the engines at full steam ahead, and he steered the ship for the conning tower of the submarine. The German commander of the U-boat saw that he wasn't going to surrender, and he had to make a decision as quick as possible. And so he took a decision to dive.
Fryatt continued to steer directly for the spot where he saw the U-boat go down.
Some reports say that the periscope of the submarine was only 2 foot away from the side of the SS Brussels. Stokers down in the engine room, some of them made statements that they felt a bump and a scrape, almost as if he had hit something.
Although damaged, U-33 survived the encounter and would go on to sink 40 merchant ships that year alone. The U-boat's deadly effectiveness even surprised the Germans themselves.
You could send them out into the western approaches, you could deploy them in the North Sea off British ports, and they proved to be, unexpectedly, a vitally important part of the First World War German Navy, perhaps the most important part in the end.
Despite the U-boat threat, Captain Fryatt continued his regular voyages across the Channel. Meanwhile, U-33's encounter with the Brussels wasn't forgotten by the Germans, as Fryatt would discover the following year. On the 22nd of June 1916, Fryatt was again in command of the Brussels, sailing from Rotterdam to Tilbury.
Among the passengers were 100 or so Belgian refugees. However, according to the Germans, he had 50 escaped Russian prisoners of war.
Shortly after leaving Holland, he was surrounded by German torpedo boats. This time, he couldn't see any course of escape, and he was forced to take control of his ship on the instructions of the commander of the torpedo boats, and he was escorted to Belgium.
The Germans scuttled the Brussels and decided to try Captain Fryatt. The charge? Attempting to ram submarine U-33. The trial began at 2 p.m. on July the 27th, 1916. The verdict? Execution by firing squad. Fryatt was dead by sunset. Britain was outraged. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith declared in the House of Commons that Fryatt had been murdered by the Germans. On the Western Front, gunners wrote defiant messages on their shells before firing them towards enemy lines. U-33 succeeded in sinking a total of 84 ships in her career. But what of the wider U-boat campaign in the waters around the British Isles? Was it successful?
It was hoped that the ruthlessness of this attack would scare off neutral shipping and would so reduce British shipping that the British Empire would cease to be an operational thing. But there were too many ships, and shipping management was so effective, it did not give a decisive result.
Although the German U-boat campaign didn't bring Britain to its knees, it proved without doubt the vulnerability of surface vessels to underwater attack. The campaign also forced the United States to totally rethink its submarine strategy. At the entrance to the Mystic Seaport dockyard in Connecticut is a vessel called Kingston II. She's small but powerful and with a surprising history. The Kingston is a tugboat constructed in the 1930s by the least experienced shipyard workers. Her job was to guide submarines in and out of port.
Kingston II was built by apprentices, if you will, learning techniques of arc welding, electric arc welding. This was a means of learning those techniques for people who would then move on to build submarines. It's actually built out of scrap steel from other submarine construction around the yard.
For 4 decades, the Kingston took out to sea more than 70 brand new subs, made by one of the USA's most prestigious submarine builders, the Electric Boat Company. The little tugboat saw a great deal of war-damaged subs return in those years, and a great deal of technological change. The naval battles of the First World War had a lasting impact on the design of submarines.
During World War I, the world kind of was shocked at the way Germany used their U-boats. So when Germany started sinking ships out of the blue, following the war, there was a large legal discussion between the main powers of the world about what submarines should explicitly be used for.
After the First World War, the US Navy decided that its submarines should be designed to survive long missions and be able to operate on their own without help from the rest of the fleet. One submarine that the Kingston assisted on her maiden voyage during the Second World War was the USS Bakuna, a diesel-powered vessel built for endurance, known as a fleet boat.
She was one of the most advanced subs of her time. The fleet boat itself was designed to operate as part of the advance force for the U.S. fleet moving across the Pacific, and so they could go from Pearl Harbor to Japan and back easy. This is the control room of Bakuna. This is the heart of the boat. This is our compressed air manifold. These different valves each correspond to a different ballast tank. The valve forces air into the tank and the water comes out. We come back up to the surface. These control the angle of the dive, so you keep control of that. With this right here, this is called the bubble, so submariners are sometimes called bubble heads. This is why. The usual angle of depth is about 7 to 10 degrees. Anything more than that and stuff starts falling off the walls, so you try to keep a controlled dive around that.
These submarines were built to withstand tremendous pressure. Bakuna's steel hull is almost an inch thick.
It's strength enough to dive down to a test depth of 300 feet. There are records of boats diving down to about 800 feet. One of them came back up and it was a full 23 inches shorter. They were crash diving. They were trying to escape a Japanese destroyer. They lost control, went down 800 feet. When they came back up, their boat was 23 inches shorter, and that was the last time she saw service. When Bakuna dives or surfaces, when you dive, you hear this alarm twice. Dive, dive. And when you surface, you hear it 3 times. But this is what it would sound like. We also have general quarters, which is battle stations. And then our collision alarm.
During World War II, submarines made up only 2% of the US Navy. Yet they sank 55% of Japan's merchant fleet and 30% of her navy. Japanese submarines were ineffective hunters.
The Japanese did not regard the attack on merchant ships as an honourable way of waging war. So they tended to use their submarines in support of their fleet and not as a weapon against the massive shipping crossing the Pacific, which might have created a sort of battle of the Pacific, rather like a battle of the Atlantic.
But the Japanese did develop a remarkable secret weapon. The largest submarine yet built, designed to attack the United States mainland. It heralded a new era of submarine warfare. During the Second World War, the Japanese Imperial Navy suffered greatly at the hands of the United States Navy, and its submarines proved to be largely ineffective. But towards the end of the war, a new submarine took to the ocean, the Japanese I-400 class. With these vessels, they hoped to change the course of the conflict. They carried 3 seaplanes in a massive hangar. And worryingly for the Americans, they had the potential to bomb cities on the West Coast.
They were built as submersible aircraft carriers. The original plan seems to have been to attack targets on the west coast of the United States, possibly using biological weapons, but there was some debate in the Japanese high command about this, and they were considered to be dishonorable.
Fortunately for the Allies, the Japanese surrendered before the I-400s could be deployed against them. The US Navy seized the gigantic subs and had begun to uncover their secrets when the Russians announced they too were sending teams of technicians to analyse the I-400s.
The Americans took them over and as quickly as they could sank them because they didn't want the Russians getting their hands on them. They didn't want the Russians to have a threat against the United States using similar ideas.
For 200 years, conflict had prompted advances in submarine technology. The threat of a Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union was no different. A new type of submarine was needed for a nuclear age. On January 21, 1954, New York's Grand Central Terminal was particularly busy for a Thursday. Extra trains had been laid on to take passengers to the banks of the Thames River in Connecticut for the launch of a very special submarine. The submarine had the hull designation 571, but was known as Nautilus, in tribute to the vessel in Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
The launch of Nautilus was a national event, truly. There were on the order of about 15,000 people who descended on the area to view the launch. The local airport was shut down to accommodate all the special charter flights that would come in. School kids lined the banks. First Lady Mamie Eisenhower was the ship's sponsor, and after all the speeches were done, she was the one who swung the bottle as the ship was launched and slid down the ways into the Thames River.
For almost 200 years, submarine designers had been trying to find a vessel that could stay underwater for the longest possible time. Diesel submarines had proved themselves to be both reliable and deadly, but they had their limitations. Diesel engines could only be used on the surface. Batteries with a limited life were used when submerged, meaning they spent only 10% of their time underwater.
With nuclear propulsion, you were no longer tethered to the surface, to the atmosphere, to rely on that oxygen to run your diesel engine, and she could run indefinitely at depth and speed, essentially limited by the amount of food that they took on board to feed the crew. And now that we were no longer on the surface, the preponderance of the time, we were effectively unable to be found, unable to be located, which made us a very venerable weapon against all other surface convoys that we might come up against.
A nuclear submarine works, in fact, on a Victorian principle, using steam to drive a turbine. Water is pumped at pressure through the nuclear reactor and is heated as the reactor core splits uranium atoms. A heat exchanger uses the hot reactor water to create the steam. Pressure from the steam then drives a turbine attached to the propeller shaft and a second turbine to generate electricity. The man behind the US Navy's nuclear program was Admiral Hyman Rickover, a maverick with an engineering background. Rickover founded a nuclear power school to train his submariners for his revolutionary fleet.
He interviewed perhaps the top 10 or 15% of the submarine school graduates at that time, personally interviewed them and selected them to go. And from then on, the training was very rigorous.
Rickover was a very formidable bureaucratic politician, very strong-minded, but he knew how to handle Congress. And he got congressional support for the nuclear submarine program and the nuclear power program in general. He truly is the father of the nuclear navy.
He rode every submarine that went to sea for the first time on their maiden voyage, and he dictated what the maximum speed would be. At some times during your career, at least as a commanding officer, whenever you were in the shipyard, you had to write him a personal letter every week and describe those things that you messed up on. And if you didn't, say, hey, you know, I messed up here, he would get on the phone and say, hey, Bell, if you didn't find anything wrong, you're not looking. Get down there and get to work.
In 1949, a prototype pressurized water reactor inside a submarine hull was constructed in a remote part of Idaho. William Engdahl, a member of Nautilus's very first crew, was sent there for training.
They actually had the whole part of the submarine there, out in the middle of the desert. We stayed there for 6 weeks and we stood watches on the hull and so forth. I think what it was, they wanted to make sure that we knew there wasn't going to be a threat or there would be no danger of nuclear power.
At 11 a.m. on the 15th of January 1955, the ever-reliable tug Kingston II assisted the Nautilus as she put to sea for the first time. Nuclear vessels needed help getting out of port, just like diesel vessels. Nautilus soon proved to be extremely quick, above and below the water.
We have a piece of the original teak decking off the ship. The ship was actually so fast at the time that this portion, as well as several other portions, were actually ripped off the deck due to the ship's incredible speed capability. We'd never before had a submarine capable of this kind of force and power.
Nautilus was loved by her crews. She had almost every creature comfort: a Coke machine, a jukebox. They even breathed purer air than on the surface.
I can still have flashbacks of different things that happened to me when I was actually at sea. I can still think of different interactions and different things we did. You're in the torpedo room right now. My bunk was right here, and I used to have a guy who used to sleep next to me, and he snored terribly. He'd keep me awake, you know? So what I'd do is I'd shake him and say, French, time to go on watch. And what he'd do is he'd get up and he'd go clean up and all that, put his clothes on, and then I'd try to get to sleep before he realized he wasn't going on watch.
The Nautilus set a remarkable number of endurance records, and in July 1958 embarked on a mission to travel under the ice and reach the North Pole.
This was President Eisenhower's response to the Soviet launching of the Sputnik satellite. We were unable to get our space program successfully into space, and we were behind in the technology race. We were also behind politically because it looked like we were falling behind the Soviets. Needing a solution, a military solution to a political problem, Eisenhower tapped the Navy and the submarine force to send Nautilus to the North Pole to prove that we had the technology and the ability to get under the ice pack and operate in an area where submarines had never operated before then.
It was a highly dangerous mission. Compasses didn't work so close to the pole, and there were no charts showing the depth of the ice. Her captain, William Anderson, was prepared to fire torpedoes to blast a hole in the ice if necessary. But on the 3rd of August 1958, Nautilus successfully passed under the North Pole. One of her crew dressed as Santa Claus to celebrate.
All hands, this is the captain speaking. In a few moments, Nautilus will realize a goal long sought by those who have sailed the seas, the attaining of the North Pole.
Nautilus went on to patrol the world's oceans for almost 30 years, a powerful symbol of naval supremacy.
While historians will tell you that the shift from, say, sails and ships of the line to coal-fired and steam-powered ships was important in naval warfare, Nautilus was not only important in naval warfare, she was also important in world history.
The nuclear submarine allowed the submarine to fulfill all its potential. They are amazing pieces of technology.
The submarine began life as a novelty, a risky experiment with little hope of success, but became central to any Navy's combat strategy, and a vessel that could single-handedly change the fortune of war.